All right, hello. I think we're all live here. Welcome to History Chats this afternoon. I don't, let me, okay. Apologies if you're hearing this, I think. Yeah, okay, it's working. That's weird. Okay, anyway, sorry. That's what I get for trying to go live a little early here. Oh, and there's an echo now. It's weird. There we go. Okay. Okay, yeah, I always have some technical difficulties after I just made sure everything was working. Anyway, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. We're going to get started in just a minute or two here. Yeah, hope you're all having a lovely day so far. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to be continuing our story of notable lasts as we wrap up our second year. Actually, so we started History Chats on September 10th, 2020. So that was almost exactly 2 years ago. And so, yeah, to wrap up the last month of our second year, we're doing some notable lasts. I can even show the graphic that I have for all of the lasts. Here we go. So we did the last log drive last week, and then, yeah, we're going to continue to go on with some other interesting stuff coming up. But speaking of things that are coming up, we have our next History Speaks lecture. This is going to be Rick Lohr is going to be returning. Last year he did a program where he shared some photographs and experiences of traveling through Poland and looking at the history and the sort of modern experience living there. And now he's going to share another travel log / history presentation, this time on the country called Myanmar, which some people, I don't know at this point if people still know it as Burma, but that's often formerly Burma. So it's a Southeast Asian country, and yeah, they've had some interesting and unfortunate civil conflict happening, I guess. And so it's kind of an interesting and also something that we may not encounter in our day-to-day life. And Rick is going to tell us about what's the community, what the people that live there and the culture and all of that, and then also about the modern issues facing the country. So yeah, that'll be a great program. That's going to be live here at 2 p.m. on Saturday, September 17th. That's not this weekend if you're watching it on or around the time that this is live, but the following week. Yeah, and of course we'll try and record. And if the internet, it's weird that I have to keep saying this, but if the internet holds out, we will be streaming it. Usually it does, but at the very least, if you can't make it in, we'll have a recording of the story later. Okay. With that, I think we're going to jump in here. So Gary's going to be talking about the last passenger train. With that, I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, Ben. We're talking about the last passenger train. Sort of an interesting story. At one time in 1970, when the last train pulled out of the depot in Wausau, but there's more to it than that. I really want to emphasize today the legacy of railroads, passenger trains. There's a large story here with railroads and passenger trains. So when we said goodbye to passenger trains in the 1970s, we said goodbye to, I think, a legacy of rich history of railroading in Marathon County, as well as specifically in Wausau. Because the railroads were an important part of that story of who we were, how we came to be as a community in this of this city. So, in the early days, this is an early picture of Wausau's depot. I think this is the Milwaukee Road. But the picture itself shows you what the importance of railroads were. Not only do we have a horse and buggy coming, most likely taking some merchandise off of the train, But a little bit in back of that, we have a horse-drawn carriage with some people. So we have the railroad bringing people, bringing materials into the city. And that legacy started, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, that started in the 1870s and carried through the 1970s, an important part of our history. And I want to tell, and it's just not a story of the trains, but it's a story of also the railroad itself and that history here. And it was in 1970, they labeled it the end of an era. Yes, perhaps the most significant era of this railroad era was perhaps the most significant part of Wausau's history. I mean, there were other eras, the White Pine era, the Wausau Group era, the paper mill era, which sort of is continuing, and a variety of other eras. Perhaps baseball is the one era that started in the 1870s and carries on, but this was the era of the railroading, was a strong part of our history, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what we begin with, and in the early days, all those wiggly lines coming through Marathon County, whether they be yellow, sort of a dark red, a blue, all indicating a variety of railroads that came through Marathon County. They all had freight, of course, and they all had passenger service. So this was an important part of people getting around. And this is coming east and west, north and south, hugging the Marathon County line, going north, coming all over. So this is how it started. And then specifically in the city of Wausau, this is Wausau in the 1870s. So now we start to see the beginning of railroading, beginning of passenger service into the city. And in 1874, the Wisconsin Valley line comes to Wausau. And the blue line indicates that line coming on the eastern border of the city, circling around, starting to cover some of the manufacturing that's starting to go in the 1870s, which at that time was mostly sawmills. But then eventually, in addition to that Milwaukee Road line, which we just saw, the Chicago Northwestern was also coming into the city. They took a little different route. They hugged most of the Wisconsin River Valley, and then their main line was to cross the Wisconsin River, head west to Marathon City and points west. But these were the two main lines that were serving the city of Wausau, and two lines that had passenger service to it. So in that passenger train history, these were the two railroad lines. And eventually, this map, 1900 again, you can see the variety of different rail lines servicing the manufacturing line going up on the northwest side, the servicing to the west side through which eventually be Marathon, 3M, a variety of lines, a very busy city with railroading. So if you're here today in Wausau and you think, well, how do I realize what the lines were? Well, we still have we still have a railroad coming north, the old Milwaukee Road line coming north from Thomas Street, Northwestern Avenue area going north. You don't recognize the Chicago Northwestern line. The only way we can recognize the Chicago Northwestern line is the Mountain Bay Trail, that pedestrian and bicycle trail that comes in from the west. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the depot in a few minutes. Of course, that is still here. But to begin with, I always think about, well, what really brought us here? And it was the white pine. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks. That's another era that we'll talk about in 2 weeks. But white pine was crucial, one of those crucial elements, one of those natural resources that really propelled Wausau and Marathon County to the history that we know today. The other part was the Wisconsin River. And as you see the logs coming down the Wisconsin River, perhaps before the rails came, they came down later on, of course, but a key element in the development of the railroads was exactly this picture of moving that lumber quicker and speedier to places like Wausau. So the railroads were an important part of our early history. So here we have the logs, the railroads took over from the Wisconsin River in bringing those logs to sawmills and eventually to paper mills in the city. So a part of bringing the freight, bringing the materials to places like Wausau. And of course, it was the other way around. It was not only coming into Wausau, but materials coming into Wausau. So here we have a picture of the Chicago Northwestern Freight Office, which was now on River. Picture this on River Drive. But here we have merchants, a variety of merchants coming to pick up the freight, the materials that they're going to be needing for their own merchandise stores. So again, railroads bringing things into service into the city of Wausau, specifically merchandise. But the important thing, and here we come back to the passenger line again, because here we have the movement of people. The movement of people started with trains, with railroads in the 1870s, and you can start to see a dramatic increase in the population of the city of Wausau, of Marathon County, but when the trains started to bring people into Marathon County and Wausau. If it wouldn't be for those trains in the early days, who knows, Wausau would be an entirely different community. The immigrants started to come in, a variety of entrepreneurs started to come in. They came in by train. They came in by that passenger train that brought like a DC Everest to Wausau in 1909 to eventually start the paper mill at Rothschild's. So the passenger trains were an important part of bringing people into this community in a variety of ways, of course, but it was the Chicago Northwestern, the Milwaukee Road. It was those coming from the west, the south, the east. They came to Wausau to settle and to make it the community it is today. And they kept on using the railroad here. Milwaukee Road. I don't think this is a special day. This is people waiting for the Milwaukee Road to come into the depot on Grant Street. I think a typical day, we don't know that there is a special person on board or whatever, but a typical day at the railroad depot, the movement of people coming and going out of Wausau. But of course, there were special days. It also brought a lot of people into the city. This is the campaign train of Wendell Willkie when he was campaigning for president. This is looking east. You can see a couple buildings in the far distant. But again, a picture of what trains did and how passenger trains came into the city and what it meant for the community for notable people. This was Wendell Willkie. Trains brought in President Coolidge, a variety of other important people through the years, but it was an essential way for people, notables as well as immigrants, to come into the city to have a campaign speech or to settle and earn a living. A very important part of our growing up here in this city. But then we quickly move into the 1950s and things started to change. This was an editorial in the Wausau paper speaking to the Chicago Northwestern. There is one consolation for Wausau residents. Passenger service on that line at least probably couldn't get any worse. So if there's ever any change, it will have to be for the better. So what we're starting to see in the 1950s, as by this article, was that things were starting to change in the city of Wausau. The Northwestern starting to lose customers. They are chomping at the bit to close lines, close service to, for instance, places like Wausau. The chamber, continuing to want that service, but it's still, the pressure was on passenger train service at the beginning, really after the war, but certainly into 1952. And then, of course, it wasn't just felt throughout, it's something that was being felt throughout central Wisconsin. The line, the Chicago Northwestern line, came from Eland over down towards Marshfield. So it was starting to affect that whole line, desperation to fight for the retention of such railroad passenger service as a completion of highway travel saddles up. For instance, here in 54, the discontinuing of these trains was ordered last April, but protesting communities succeeded in obtaining a suspension. So cities continued to argue for retention, but the passenger train service was certainly on its way out here in the 1950s. And this is the Chicago Northwestern Depot. It's still there today, still there on Washington Street. But once that train service ended, of course, that depot has seen many different ways of a lot of travel agents, restaurants, a variety of other services have gone into that building, and currently it is purchased by the Wausau Chamber of Commerce for their headquarters. So fortunately, this historic landmark has been kept for our heritage in the city. But in the 1950s, as we are starting to see the end of an era, we're starting to see the beginning of an era. Because we start to see in the early 50s, we see that, a bus station is being moved from 4th Street over to the Northwestern Depot. So we're starting to see, with the increased spending on highways and all that, we're starting to see bus service starting to make a big impact on the city. The Union Bus Depot, the Greyhound lines, the motor bus lines, Green Bay, Wausau lines, Land O'Lakes lines, all a variety of bus service now is starting to come into the city, and we're starting to see the transition from rail to other forms of transportation in and out of the city. So if you wanted to go to Chicago, eventually you could go to the 4th Street Wausau Bus Depot and get a bus to Chicago. This was in 72. We start to see that happening here in Wausau. And then also a headline in the Wausau paper, proposed bypass, real progress, says the mayor. So in addition to the buses, we're building an extensive bypass, or what came to be a Highway 51 or Highway 39 to the west of the city, that brings fast service by auto to places to the south or to the north, and eventually to the east and the west. So with the addition of these 4-lane highways, we're now starting to see the diminishing of the need for rail service in the city. So this bypass, heralded by the mayor as a good thing, that era is another story unto itself, but maybe we'll tell that story someday. But the addition of it just meant that the automobile was starting to replace rail traffic and the automobile and truck traffic was starting to replace the rail as a way of bringing people and materials into the city. And then in addition to that, of course, we have a new airport in the city. So in addition to that, we have air service now coming into the city, the new airport. This is the new airport at that time on the southeast side, Wausau Municipal Airport. But again, now the airlines, North Central Airlines, a variety of airlines are starting to come in. So you can get a quick trip to Chicago or Minneapolis and speed you on your way in and out of the city of Wausau. So again, these more modern ways of transportation is starting to replace the rails as an important part of transportation in the city. So then eventually, so we've already talked about the Chicago Northwestern. Now, eventually, into the late 1960s, the concern is starting to raise about the Milwaukee Road coming into the city. So again, it's starting to say, the demise of rail passenger service does not suddenly confront a community. It's something that's gradually and gradually it came to the city of Wausau a big concern because eventually 1 year after that headline about a concern, the end of passenger train service ends in Wausau, October 1970. So this was a big thing. This was major headlines in the paper detailing the end of it, and not only in Wausau, but it was the whole line from Wausau south, Wisconsin Rapids. I think this was from the Wisconsin Rapids paper. The last train, it's the end of the line for number 202 and 203. And just like they said, this is going to be a funeral. So it was lamented. People knew it was coming, but it was still being very much lamented within those communities on this line. Last passenger, again, another reminder that these trains will be ending in the city, and they made there's a passenger collecting one of his last tickets on that route, and this is the gathering. It's a Stevens Point Journal paper, but it is the Wausau Depot. The last gathering of the folks for that last trip, October the 7th. And this is the final riders of on the Wausau passenger train, October the 7th, 1970. And here it goes into the landscape, into the horizon, the last train pulling out of the city and never really to be back again. The final days of passenger service, and it's really the last days of rail service. Like I said, the Chicago Northwestern completely discontinued any kind of service. There's service, of course, today on the Milwaukee Road route, but it has certainly been diminished through the years. And of course, the depot, here is a picture of them, of the Milwaukee Road, clearing out that depot in 78. And then fortunately, history has preserved that depot. Also, we have both Chicago Northwestern and the Milwaukee Road depots, but the lingering effect of that last passenger service, the legacy, again come back to that, the legacy of how important that passenger service was, that freight service was on the railroads coming through Wausau, an important part of our history. Just a little bit with regard to the Milwaukee Road Depot, the Boy Scouts would eventually come in to use it. There was some questions at one time about saving the depot. Of course, it has been saved through the years, but there was a strong drive to save the depot. Was threatened at one time. But it was an end of an era, that era of passenger train service, of passengers coming and going into the city, basically having a large legacy on our history, and that's an important part of who we are today. So again, the last iconic pictures of the last trains coming out, and the iconic picture of that Milwaukee Road in front of that depot. Great photos, great testimonies, great reminders, really, of the great importance of that story in our history. So with that, I turn it back to Ben. If there's comments or questions, we certainly would be anxious to see anything that you have to say today. Thank you, Ben.
Hey, yeah. Well, thank you, Gary. I mean, as we've been talking about some interesting lasts, this is definitely one of those end of the era. Although, interestingly, I guess I can, it's been a while since I've done this, but I'll throw out a question. This is the last passenger service, but there have been passenger trains coming through here, right? Like we've had some brought out for fun, for...
There's been little log jams, I think, of a variety of other special passenger excursions, for instance, from Wausau. Yes,
Not quite the same.
not quite the same.
Yeah. Again, I'm gonna take a look here. But yeah, I bring that up because that actually tends to be a theme in actually our month-long series that we're doing here of lasts. Sometimes the last thing isn't the last thing, or maybe it is. We'll have to see how the tally going forward of whether it is the last, in fact, thing, including the last fur auction, which is going to be next week's topic. I'm sure some of you may be interested to know more about the Fromm farm up in Hamburg. It's always a popular topic for good reason. And yeah, you may not know this, but they had one of the biggest fur auctions in North America for a number of years straight. And for whatever reason, we'll have to tune in next week to find out why. But yeah, after 1939, no more auctions up in Hamburg. Or are there? I guess we'll find out. Anyway, let me just take a look. I see some comments thanking us for the presentation. Echo that again. Great presentation. And I'll thank everybody who's still watching for watching. Yeah, it's great that you're enjoying the history. And like I said, we'll come back next week with some more. But I think maybe we'll call it there today. So yeah, thanks for watching. Have a wonderful week, and we'll